Introduce you, and I'll continue to let them in the waiting room.
Okay.
Okay. So, welcome everyone. This is the Lyon Township Genealogy Program tonight. We are pleased to have Christine Cohen with us. What I'd like to tell you is I will keep putting in the handout into chat. I know I sent it to you, but I wasn't sure if all of you did get it or not, so we'll keep putting it in there. Christine has asked for the questions to be put into chat, and we will read them at the end. And let's see what else. I think what I'm going to do is read Christine's bio and let her start, and I'll keep letting people in. So we are very pleased to have with us tonight Christine Cohen. She's a longtime member of the Whittier Area Genealogical Society and has served in many capacities, including president. In addition to the Whittier Area Genealogical Society, she is also a member of the Redondo Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Society of the Daughters of Holland, and the Association of Professional Genealogists. Her interest in genealogy began in 1977 with the airing of the TV miniseries Roots, and was piqued when she found a typed pedigree chart of her Dutch heritage from the New Netherlands in the 1600s. She is a native Californian, a graduate of UCLA in political science, and has worked for, is it Viota?
Well, it's actually Vitol, but I am actually retired now. After 30 plus years of working, I decided to leave and pursue genealogy full time, which is just an
Oh,
awesome thing. I would recommend it highly to anybody who can do it.
oh, I love that. I'm glad you get to do that. We are also going to ask everyone to mute themselves and mute your video feed so that being that we're going to have so many in this tonight, it will help with our bandwidth. So I'm going to say, take it away, Christine.
Well, thank you so very much for having me here this evening. I'm going to stop my video so you can concentrate on watching my slides. I don't want there to be any problems because there's a lot of information to learn on these slides. So we're going to talk about mysterious codes. What do those letters and numbers mean? Maybe you've seen them, maybe you haven't, and you're just not sure what they are. So I want you, when we're done tonight, to go back and look at those passenger lists. And have you noted anything on them and just wondered what in the world do those different letters, numbers, different handwritings, stamps, things in the margin mean? You have maybe just overlooked them. So you've never noticed that Teresa here has 12X on here. So this means that she likely started her naturalization in St. Louis, Missouri. That gives you an insight of where you want to start to look. And those little codes all mean something, and we're going to talk about them. So the codes really began in earnest after 1891 when the federal government took over from the states in monitoring and making the duties at a federal level. So if you have, like me, 1660 ancestors, 1700 ancestors, realistically, these are not going to be on there. These are only going to be on here after 1891. But maybe your ancestor came over in the 1860s, 1870s and got their citizenship, stayed here and decided, I need to go get a bride. I need to bring mom and dad. I need to bring my cousin over. And they leave and come back again. So think about that when you're doing your research. And then you maybe want to look at these codes. So you may again see a number 2 with a little digit and a date, or you may see admitted and SL over here. What do those mean? We're going to talk what those could mean. So if you haven't done so, I like to look at all of the different companies that offer passenger manifests, because this is one from MyHeritage. Maybe you only use Ancestry, Family Search, or the Ellis Island site for those New York records. I like MyHeritage sometime because they, as you can see, they use a grayscale background. So if you're having trouble even finding your ancestors' passenger manifest, you want to look at every different companies because they may have filmed it in a different background. So this is one thing that you may see. And I like the MyHeritage version of this manifest because it's pretty easy when you look at a broad overview to see the items in here that were made by the shipping clerk after they had created the passenger list. So those items there. And we see the little check marks that were made after the person has boarded. Everything is all set. So it's this, I think sometimes it's nice to be able to view it this way to get a better idea of when those additional notations were made. So we're going to talk about a lot of acronyms and notations today. Now, your handout, you're going to have more details on what all of these mean, because we're going to talk about the numbers on a ticket or contract we can find in the left-hand column. We'll talk about what happened if they missed the boat. They didn't sail. That also can be listed in the left-hand column. We also want to think about talking about, was notation made about their nationality, if they were a citizen or not a citizen. Really important is the Board of Special Inquiry in the left-hand column. The little X's, the D's, were they held for an inquiry? Did they have to go before a board to plead their case on why they should be staying in this country? Were they maybe under the Exclusion Act of a likely public charge? We'll talk about what that means. Were they perhaps having an issue and they were deported or excluded and not able to immigrate? That did happen, and maybe they then immigrated to a different port. You may say, I can't find them in New York. Well, they had some troubles, so they came into Boston instead. Did they have some medical issues? Now, Ellis Island was known for having a very good medical facility, but maybe there were some issues and it's noted on there. How about a verification of landing or a permit in the name column? You may see something like that and never realize what that coding means. We'll talk about that. How about a Form 404 or 405? Your ancestor wanted to become a citizen. They're going to need a form that the INS uses. Then you may see a notation regarding their citizenship with the letter C and some notations afterward. Or what if they needed a visa? After 1924, you needed a visa to come into the US. So you're going to see notations in these columns about what kind of visa that your ancestor had. So let's start with the contract. This was entered into by the immigrant and the shipping line, or an agent of the shipping line. Maybe you got a ticket that said, take me from New York, or from London to New York, Liverpool to New York, Hamburg to New York, and that was it. Or maybe you got something that said, take me from Liverpool to uh, Minnesota, or take me from Liverpool to Iowa. So you may find where they had a transatlantic voyage and then they had final transportation. I thought this was an interesting little document that I found, a broadside regarding Hamburg to Antwerp, not Galveston, Texas. If you are looking for Jewish ancestors in the early 1900s and you're having trouble finding them, you may want to look in these passenger lists to Galveston, Texas, because there was a big push to get families into the Midwest, and they came through Galveston, Texas. I don't think that's a port that's often looked at, but this was what they would have, your ancestor would have seen, the broadside on the side of the building. So the ticket agent forwarded the information to the company, and that clerk then used the records to make that passenger list. This was done in the home country. It is not done in the US. Maybe there was a prepaid ticket that perhaps the husband who's living in Baltimore wants to bring his new wife over, his new bride, so he can marry her. So he prepays for the ticket and says she is eligible to come. So here's an example that I found. And on your handout, I have a link to this really interesting article from a Jewish-based website, but it applies to all of us as immigrants, Avantayu Online, where we see a prepaid passenger list for a person who paid $24 to go from Bremen. So this is a great little website link that's on your handout that's really fun to read. So the reason I bring up the ticket number is maybe you're having trouble finding your ancestor coming in from Liverpool. These ticket numbers mostly apply to Liverpool. But maybe you're having trouble and you've looked and looked and looked and for those inbound passenger records. Well, how about looking on the outbound passenger records? These are found on Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage. This list of UK and Ireland outbound passenger lists from 1890 to 1960, a very huge immigration time for many of our ancestors. So as you can see, they didn't really ask us many questions. They basically asked, where are you coming from? Are you an adult? Are you English, Scotch, Irish, or are you a foreigner? But I'm trying to find someone named Emma Ansander, and I can't find her in the records through Ellis Island. So I'm going to go into this document and I see her listed there. There's Emma. I've highlighted her. She's 19 and she's from Sweden, so she's listed as a foreigner. But we see her ticket number listed there. That number is 7676. So if you know perhaps the actual ship, but you've scoured and can't find her, well, maybe you need to then go to the ship and scroll through the actual ship manifest and don't look at the names. You can't do a search that way, but you can just eyeball and try and find a search until you come to 7676. And there you find Emma Ansander. So this may be a way around finding your ancestor. These were usually 2 to 7 digit numbers. As I said, most of these are coming from England, especially Liverpool, but I think this ticket number sometimes can be a nice workaround. If you're having trouble finding a name, maybe you can peruse the manifest by looking for numbers. And a lot of the information I talked to you tonight, you may find your ancestor in all of these records, but you want to put a little social context about them. And one of the websites that's on your handout is called G&G Archives. It's a social and cultural historical documentation of steamship and ocean liner documents, photos, passenger lists, archives. So you may see, now this probably isn't your ancestor, but this is what your ancestor who was on a steamship from Gothenburg, Sweden in third class in steerage. Her name is Esther Hilma Maria Magenston on the Stockholm White Star Line. And this is what her ticket looked like. So if you want to perhaps find something similar to what your ancestor may have encountered, this can at least put a little picture, make it maybe more interesting to your family members. So perhaps go to this site, it's on your handout, and poke around and see what you can find. So what I did, I looked for the Cunard line, and here is a image of that ship that Emma came in on the far right, lower right corner of the Campania. This was it landing in Liverpool. So this is what Emma would have seen when she got on the ship. On the upper right, here is a picture of it. On the upper left, I think it's interesting. This is what the ship looked like, where your ancestor was on that ship for, a few weeks at a time. And the lower left, it's going to tell you the actual route that it took. So I think it's just a fun website to put some context I wanted to show you. So let's talk about that dreaded not shipped, not on board, did not sail, canceled, not embarked. You may have not realized or not noticed anything like this before. But let's meet my friend Antonio. I'm not related to him, but I just wanted to show you because I think he provides a nice example. So Antonio is a single gentleman from Italy in 19, he's 25 years old, and he wants to come to America. So November 9th, 1923, he buys a ticket and says, I want to go to New York. Well, on that manifest, his last known residence is Italy. That is all that clerk noted. Well, it appeared it didn't work out for him. So December 2nd, he tries again. I'm going to come through Philadelphia. We're going to get a little bit of different info. This says his last residence was just Italy. Still not great. So finally, the next day, he decides, I'm going to land in New York. And what do we tell you on here? His last known residence. And also, the first embarkation he tried, person in the US was named Mr. Minucci. However, the last time he tried to enter, his name was Pellegrino Minucci. So if this is your ancestor, you definitely want to look to see each time he bought a ticket and the clerk made notes, maybe they noted different things. So I'm going to go out to Ancestry and I'm going to look at attempt number 1 And I find him at the very top, line number 1, and we see he is X'd out. So even though he didn't sail, he didn't tell them in time, so he is still listed there. But at the very bottom of the page, we see the little red flag. He did not sail. Attempt number 2, again, he decided I'm going to go to Naples and I'm going to go to Philly. Well, that didn't work either for him. So we look at the very bottom. Mr. Minucci canceled, did not sail. But again, you may find a little bit more information on each of these attempts. Finally, for Mr. Minucci, he appeared to make it. He came to New York. And then when they asked him, where are you going after you land? He says, well, actually, I'm going to Boston. So he actually wanted to experience all of America, it seemed. And one thing that I think is fun to do, especially maybe for younger people, maybe go out and learn some information. This was the America. This was the ship that Anthony came over on. So I went out to RootsWeb and I found a little information about it. I realized that he was among 2,400 other people traveling in third class. I was able to find a picture of it. It was an Italian ship and it was scrapped in 1928. So just a little flesh on the bone about your ancestor. I think it's kind of fun to do. Now, how about updates by the purser? Now, you may never have realized it, but sometimes the purser made a note that something changed. So they would make a note on the passenger manifest and make a little note. Well, his name was Matthew Curran or Curran. I am not really sure. This, of course, is not my name was changed at Ellis Island. This is just the purser maybe updating something. So if you're having trouble finding your ancestor, of course, one way to spell their name, look if maybe it was indexed in a different way. But occasionally you will see these updates by the purser, or when he came before the immigration inspector and he said, how do you spell your name, Matthew? Maybe his Irish accent was a little thick and the purser or the inspector said, oh, no, 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 I see, let's fix this. So that is what happened here. But you may see that every now and then. Now, how about Matteo Morio here? What do we see? Well, we're going to see in that column in the middle a nativity of what country do you belong. And it appears when they first came through, there's diddle marks for all of those children listed there. But when they got before the purser said, or the immigration inspector said, and questioned the mother here and said, where were your children born? And she wrote, oh, no, no, no. They were born in the US. They were born in the US. And as you see on the right, when it was indexed, they did note US citizenship, but maybe she was wrong. So definitely look at these items where they talk about nationality or citizenship and see if there were perhaps an update made. So that's something I think everybody should look for in that column. How I'd like to introduce you to Daniel Rooney. He is a gentleman living in Butte, Montana in 1915. I find his naturalization there. He was living in Butte. He's a minor. He was born in County Down in Ireland. And he says that I came over on the ship, the Cimarrack, in 1907. So, oh, okay, great. So I go out, I find that passenger manifest, and I see, yep, there he is, Daniel. He arrived as he said he did. That's great. However, he decided after he got citizenship to go back to Ireland to see his wife, who he left behind. So in 1917, the passenger manifest changed so that people who were US citizens were listed on a different set of papers than people who were immigrants. So Daniel is not going to be on the section with the other immigrants. He's a citizen. So they asked Daniel, well, when did you become a citizen? Well, he tells them, I became a citizen in Butte, Montana, at the Supreme Court, 26 November 1915. So isn't that nice to tell you the exact day, the exact place, and the exact courthouse that we need to go find those naturalization records? So I think maybe you want to think about looking for your ancestor who perhaps got citizenship and went back to visit his wife, his mother, his grandma, his cousins, or something like that. And when he came back in, he's a US citizen, so he's going to be on a different part of the manifest. Now, how about a passport? Here we meet Jacob Marinus. He is Jacob Manson, sorry. He's 28 years old. And when they asked him, are you a native person, native born, or are you naturalized? He decided to say, well, I have a passport. So he gave the documentation about his passport, his exact number and when he got it and where he got it. So I was able to go out to Ancestry, and they have these applications from 1795 to 1925. And I was able to find a copy of his passport telling me where he was born in Denmark and he's living in Iowa, who his father is. And because it's in the 1920s that he got this, on the far right, we get a photo of him. So make sure you peruse those lists to see if you have a US citizen. Now, how about US citizens who the clerk decided to be very judicious and not just say, if native born, give me the date and place. He listed every single person's date and place of birth. And if you look at these closely, a lot of these are a time frame, like in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1863, that you probably are not going to find any birth documentation. But right here on this list of citizens, they went ahead and listed where they were born in the US. But unfortunately for Frederick Mason here, he says, if naturalized, give the name of the court. And he says, yep, I was naturalized in Davenport, Iowa in November of 1898. So you want to make note of these lists of US citizens if they tell you where they were naturalized. How about non-immigrant aliens? These are people who did not want to stay in the US. They were just traveling through in transit. Maybe they were going to Canada, to Mexico, to Asia, they were here on business. They were students studying. They were people that weren't planning to stay here. They just wanted to come visit. Especially, this is very typical for Canadians. You will see a lot of them coming through New York and then going up to Canada. So you're should look for non-immigrant alien stamp. And when you see that, that's your indicator that your English ancestor who was going into Canada came in through New York, and he's listed as a non-immigrant alien. Or maybe they're listed as a tourist. So you'll see non-immigrant alien, and then someone says your final destination is Toronto, Canada. So definitely if you're having trouble finding your Canadian ancestors, maybe they came through New York and then transitioned up to Canada. How about those stations when your immigrant ancestor came in? On the far left, the Park Service has a display there. Those are how big the manifests are. We don't really cannot picture how big they are because they're on our tiny little computer monitors, right? But if you can see the gentleman on the far left, look at how large those are. And that is what the inspection they had to undergo. Now, keep in mind, only steerage passengers had to undergo this inspection. First and second class passengers received a quick inspection while on the ship because the federal government thought that if you could afford a first or second class ticket, you were less likely to have any financial or medical reasons not to make it in the US. And you also see all of the gentlemen look very spiffy, don't they, in their three-piece suits and their ties? Well, you, of course, wanted to make a great impression upon the inspection clerk when you came befriend them. You didn't want to go back. So what you may see that was on an inspection card that was pinned to the passenger. You'll see this sometimes if you see images and newsreels of passengers disembarking, where they have a landing tag that was pinned and it gave their name, the ship they were on, where they left, the stamps going to tell them that they went through inspection, they went through quarantine, and they went through the Immigration Bureau. And you'll see a big number 4, perhaps. You'll see numbers written on here. Well, that number 4 is a clue to the clerk as to where to go find the person on the passenger manifest. If you think about it, Antonio Minucci, our friend, had 2,400 people with him. So the clerk has to go through page after page. So we see the number 4 listed on here. And if you somehow ended up with one of these pieces of ephemera about your immigrant ancestor, that would be so awesome. But here's Benjamin, which I really hope isn't one of any of your ancestors, because how challenging that must be to have Benjamin to be researching. But when we go out to the SS Philadelphia sailing from Southampton, and we see the number of page 4, and there we find our friend Benjamin listed there. Now they go up to the clerk, and in 1907, and this of course changes over time, the questions that were listed on the passenger immigration forms, but really the highlighted ones I have in blue were the most important. How old are you? What is your occupation? How much money do you have? Are you coming to America for work? What and where will you work? Realize 2,400 people had to be processed. There wasn't time to ask 29 questions, but these were the most important that the clerk was going to be asking these people. So if they didn't answer the questions correctly, they may have been held or put for Board of Special Inquiry. And you may see a notation, a letter D, a letter X, a check mark. So on those manifests for the Port of New York after 1903, you're going to start seeing those notations in the far left-hand corner. And if they came through Philadelphia, they had to use the letter D for detained, and that seemed to start about August of 1893. You may see the word held, meaning there was some issue and they needed to be pulled aside and they weren't able to leave. You may see SI for special interest or BSI, and they estimate about 10% of incoming passengers overall were held. So if you have an ancestor who came in through these two ports, you may want to scroll to most of the time at the very back of the manifest, the last few pages, there'll be one set of records called Record of Detained Aliens, and the next page will have Record of Aliens spelled for special inquiry. So let's look and see what those records are going to show us. So they're going to say, why were these people held for special inquiry? Most of the time, this is going to apply to women. These are often single women who are coming to meet their husbands, their fiancés. They were worried about the integrity, the morality of these women. So most of the time, these marks are going to be beside a female ancestor, but not always. So here is what the Ellis Island third floor looked like, where they waited for the hearing before they went for the inquiry. Sometimes they could be there for days, sometimes they could be there for months. Well, they were held perhaps because they were going to be what they started calling in 1891 the likely public charge. They were worried that they would not be able to support themselves. So you had to confirm that you had a job, you had friends, you had family here, you had family back home if things didn't go well. So this is the notation LPC, LPC that you're going to see over and over and over again. So here's just one little snapshot of a record of aliens held for special inquiry. The cause of dissension, LPC, they had no visa. Physical deformity, LPC, LPC. You see that over and over and over again. That was one of the most common causes to be detention. However, interestingly, the second box I highlighted was admitted. Every single person on this page, except this gentleman down here, who was a stowaway, was able to resolve their issues after a few days, and they were admitted. So this gentleman had to be sent back on the next available ship, but everybody else was able to resolve their issues. I think that's pretty interesting. So it's pretty true that a majority of the people were able to resolve the issues and have someone come assist them and being able to disembark. Now, let's do a couple examples here. We have Caterina Loatelli. She's an Italian lady arriving in New York in 1909. We see her on page, big highlighted there, page 35. She's on line 4. She states that she's from Italy, but what perhaps is her red flag? Well, they ask her the name and address of the nearest relative in the country you came from back in Italy, and she says, nope, there is nobody. Well, that rang, set off red flags for the inspector. But she did state on page 2 that no, I have my husband. He's here. He lives on Sullivan Street in New York, and he will be taking care of me. However, they did pull her aside. So if I scroll through that passenger manifest and I go to the back of the page and I see to image 151, my record of detained aliens, and I find on line 9, there's Caterina listed and her cause of detention, meaning she's going to be released to her husband who lives on Sullivan Street. And she didn't have any meals, so she wasn't there very long, but they wanted to talk to her and make sure that someone was going to pick her up. So I was very surprised to see my grandfather, who came from England, was coming in 1913. He's Leonard Johns. He's an assayer. He's British. He's from England. He's going to Silver City in New Mexico to meet his brother. So I find this on page 12, image 12 of the Pastor Manifest. But when I did a search on Ancestry, actually, I found him twice. He's listed there where I find him, but below he's listed again. Well, that's because if I scroll through to image 148 of 50, I find him listed for a record of detained aliens. I have no idea why he was held and he had to have one meal. Unfortunately, he passed away before I could ever ask him, why did you have so much trouble at Ellis Island? Because he had $50. He spoke English. He'd been in the US before. He had his mother back in the old country. He was going to his brother. But you never know who could have perhaps been held for special inquiry. How about record of detained aliens in the column of cause of detention? They use this column to say who came to pick them up. So you're often going to see to husband, to father, to aunt, to brother. Most of the time, it is a male relative that is going to assist these females, but it can be helpful to you. You may never realize where your ancestor went to live right after they got off the ship. Well, maybe they went to live with an aunt. You never thought to look that up, or a cousin. And on the left there, you see a telegram. So this is often seen where people don't have enough money to leave and they need to get money to go to their final destination. Another section of the form is the dispensation column. This is where we're going to see, well, who were they released to? Who came and got them? So we can see they arrive in New York, but they go all over the US, to Colorado, to Pennsylvania, to Nevada, to Ohio. So if you've always wondered, where did they end up after they got off the ship? Well, you may want to see if they were detained, and maybe it'll give you the destination and where they're going. So you may see to telephone money, meaning they needed a telegram to be sent from the relatives to be able to get them to leave. So we have Inocia here, Mina, and on the far left, in the upper left, we have a little check mark, meaning she was held for special inquiry. And we're on image 243 of the passenger list. Now her issue is she's 19 years old, she's single, she's a domestic from Italy. Well, they don't like those single women traveling on their own. So if we scroll through to the back of the manifest, image 393, we find her there in the record of detained aliens. And we see that she was released to her father, who is out all the way in Colorado. Well, he had to send some money so she could get on a train and get there. And it took him a few days to get the money. And I also thought it was very interesting. If you look at her name, in the manifest, she's M-I-N-N-A, but by the time the detained alien section is written out, she's M-I-N-N-O. As we all know, spelling does not count in genealogy, so keep that in mind. So how about we introduce you to Maria Rapas here? She is a Turkish female. She's 17, but she's married. She was born in Greece and she left Napoli and she arrived in 1913. But what do we see next to her name? That dreaded X. Well, that means that she was held for special inquiry. So we go to the next page and we see, well, no, she says, I have a husband, Stephen Rapas. He is going to come get me. But they concern, well, you're a 17-year-old female. Do you really have a husband? We're going to perhaps hold you until your husband can come get you. So when we see that record of detained aliens she has now become Mary instead of Maria, and Rapas has changed a few vowels there. They did release her to her husband. Well, he was way up in Somerset, Massachusetts, so he had to come all the way to New York to get her. And we see on the far right the number of breakfasts, lunches, and dinners that she had. She was there for at least 3 breakfasts, 3 lunches, and 3 dinners. Now realize the shipping company is the one who had to pay for these, so they didn't want people to be held. They wanted people to go through quickly. So your ancestor hopefully made it through quickly, so they didn't have to pay for all of these meals. I did a quick search about those meals that they obtained, and Ellis Island had a concession restaurant, and it gave an example of how much it cost in 1904. It was 5 cents for breakfast, 11 cents for dinner, and 8 cents for supper. And this is what a typical meal consisted of, and this is what the shipping company had to pay. And I found an interesting little article there that was written in The Independent in Wahoo, Nebraska, and it was explaining about the immigrants who came through on Easter were given ice cream, and none of them had ever seen ice cream in their life. And it said that the Italian immigrants did not take kindly as to the ice cream, and they tried to make the attendant understand they would like to have it warmed up. So I thought that was kind of funny that there was never had ice cream in Italy before, perhaps. So, a common cause of detention, as I mentioned, was the lack of tickets to their final destination. They had enough money to get on the ship and they got to where they needed to be, but then they couldn't get that ticket to go forward. So, here we have an example of Vigilio Osono. He is a gentleman, and we see him on the record of detained aliens, and we see TEL $. So someone needed to send him money to get the RR, the railroad, so he could go see his brother in Langford, Pennsylvania. So just for heck, I went and looked in the 1910 census because he arrived in January, and I find him listed there, and he did, as he said, lived in Lansford, Pennsylvania. But I want you to note real quickly, how is his name spelled? He has become Vigilio Osana on the record of Aliens, and in the 1910 census, it's been mangled to Vilio Oshana. So he seems to have become Irish, perhaps. I'm not really sure. Again, spelling does not count. Now, what if your ancestor had trouble going through the port? Well, my grandmother had some trouble, and the YWCA assisted her. But you may see an aid society listed if your ancestor was Jewish. Perhaps the Haas was able to assist them if they were Irish. The DAR, the Salvation Army, maybe their faith was able to assist them if they were Catholic or something like that. You may not have realized that that could have been noted on the immigration list. So let me introduce you to Ernestine Gallo. She arrives for September 1920, and on the page she is waiting for her betrothed, Ercolio Fasano, and he is going to come get her. Well, he does come get her, but they need the assistance of the Committee of Italian Aid Society to be their middleman. So I went and found the certificate of marriage for the two of them. And at the bottom, it says that who reported their marriage? Well, the San Rafael Society for Italian Immigrants. And when did this happen? This happened the 5th of September. So she arrived on the 4th. They would not let her leave until she married her betrothed. So if you're having any trouble finding your ancestor, they ended up in Chicago and they were married, but you can never find their marriage. Maybe they had to get married in New York, in Philadelphia, in Boston before they could leave the ship. So think about that when you're doing your research. Also think about if you find a notation about being assisted. I did a search of Archive Grid. I hope you're all using this in your research. The St. Raphael Society for Italian Immigrant Records are held at the Center for Migration Studies in Staten Island. So maybe there's a record of her embarkation and her assistance. So definitely look to see if maybe an aid society was out there assisting your ancestor, and that aid society's records are housed in a historical society or something like that. Now, how about Rosa here? We see at the top that her name is very mangled, but it's Rosada Corlilo. We don't see any T's there, but we see the SI for special inquiry. And what is her big red flag? Well, again, she said, I have nobody in the old country. So we go to the next back of the passenger manifest to image 104, and we see that she's listed as a detained alien. They're making a special inquiry because they think she's going to become a public charge. Her name has again changed from Rosa to Rosa Corlito. Then we scroll through to image 106, and she had to go forth before the Special Inquiry Board, and she was admitted, but I want to show you again, how was her name? She's now Rosa Cortito. Again, spelling doesn't count. So they go for that board of special inquiry, and there's 3 inspectors there, and they need to plead their case. I have a job. I have a husband. I should be able to come into this country. And about 10%, as I said, were held and went before the board, and about 2%, though, were sent back. So here was an image that I found again on the Library of Congress of what they show that a special inquiry board looked like. It was usually 3 gentlemen. And they would again ask them all of these questions. They could have an interpreter if they didn't speak the language well. They could have witnesses come forward. So you, of course, wanted to impress because if they excluded you, you would then be put on the next ship back. And if they were detained, and if your ancestor came through Philadelphia, the hard copies of these records of what was done during that Board of Special Inquiry are held at the National Archives in Philadelphia. But if you can't get there, you can go out to Ancestry. And so let's do a search. So we're going to find Barbara Garhammer here, arriving from Germany. She's arriving from Philly, arriving into Philly May 7th, 1896. And we see the letter D next to her name and the name of her child. She's 26. Her child appears to be a newborn. So she was perhaps detained, and it falls into that window where I could see some records. So I'm going to go out to Ancestry. I'm going to go to the Immigration Records Special Board of Inquiry, 1893 to 1909. Now, I did a search for BAR asterisk and GAR asterisk to narrow my search window, but I know the exact arrival date of the ship. So it shows that she was from Germany and she was on the Roland. So I'm able to look at the records. And what do the records tell me? Well, they're going to tell me that she's 26 years old. She has a child who's 11 months old, and she is going to visit her intended husband and the father of her children. She is also traveling with her niece. So you get all these wonderful detailed records about what was going on in Barbara's life. So this is on May 7th, right after she arrived. So on May 8th, the board says, well, your intended needs to come to Philadelphia. We're not releasing you otherwise. So that note is made. By May 11th, the gentleman arrives and he says, you need to go get married right now. So if we go out to the Philadelphia Inquirer, we find on May 12th that Barbara and John Hoffenkopf have been married, basically 6 days after she got off the boat. Another similar instance, we have Francesco Caroso. He's arriving in 1909. Now, this is a little bit later, so oftentimes these records are typed written, but on the far left there, we see lots of X's, so we know things didn't go well for him when he first arrived. So we go back out to that database and we're going to get details typed up about, have you been here before? Where is your wife? Oh, she's back in Italy with our other children. Well, who's with you? My 3 children. Where are you going to go live? Well, I'm going to go live with my brother. What's his name? Where does he live? What is going to happen with you? And he was then led into the country. But wouldn't this be so interesting to read about the words your ancestors said to the board so they could come into this country? Now, unfortunately, though, records may be available for Board of Inquiry for those, basically for Philadelphia is all that really you can ever find online. The only other records you can find are people who appealed their decision to deport them or have issues with their importation. So a majority of the time, you're not, unfortunately, going to be able to find much about these Board of Special Inquiries for New York or Boston, unless your ancestor appealed to the INS to say, I should be able to come into the US. So you may find something like this for the Port of Baltimore. This one was excluded by the Board of Special Inquiries for Baltimore, and the reason was he was a stowaway. So that is a big red flag. He was excluded because he was a stowaway. Maybe there's some records about him. So you can go out to the USCIS genealogy program, and as of April 1st, it's been reduced to $30. You can have them do a search and see if there's any records about Alfredo and his decision to appeal and not be deported. So they give me a number. I then write to the National Archives. I have this number about Alfredo. I'd like to have his special inquiry documentation. So here we have his case files before the special inquiry, and he goes on and on where he says, why did you stow away? I want to appeal my case. I came to the US. You get all these wonderful little details out of your ancestors' own words about where they interacted. So I think this can be so very interesting if you had an ancestor who did appeal the decision. So how about someone named Carolina Stoper here? Again, she has an SI, meaning she was held before that Board of Special Inquiry. What was her problem? Well, she was in the hospital. She has some sort of medical issue, so they wouldn't let her come in. Well, that's not good for her because she had the dreaded trachoma. This is an eye disease that they used, which I'm sure was not very clean, a button hook to look underneath your eyelid to see if you should be held for special inquiry, or you were sent back because you had what they called a dangerous contagious disease. This is pre antibiotics, of course. And we see things didn't go well for Catalina because on the far right, we see on the deported column, she was sent back. So if you think your ancestor had some trouble, you may want to go out to Ancestry, Your Family Search, or My Heritage and look in this index to the correspondence of immigration and naturalization files. So this is a database of about 200,000 index cards that have about 5 entries per card, and you can see what happened to them. And so you can see Coralina is listed here. She was fined $100, which of course I'm sure she did not have to pay, and she sent back because she has the dreaded trachoma. But you can see why the people were sent back. They had ringworm, they were feeble-minded. You're going to learn all these information. And these cards are sorted by the subject. The subject is the name of the ship that they came on. So how about we look at another person? This is Honorilla Negrum. She's 48-year-old housewife. She's traveling with her 2 children. Now, she's not traveling with her husband, so she's held, and they consider her perhaps a likely public charge. But if we go to the far right, we see that she had 36 meals. That's an awful long time. And then when we go out to that index, we see her listed there by the name of the ship. We see that the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society assisted her. We see that she's illiterate. So what could this mean? Well, this could mean a big red flag that maybe she has a file and you want to go look for it because that's an awful long time to be held. If you have troubles with doing searches, I think everybody should be using History Hub. So this was a resource by the National Archives where the archivist there and other genealogists will crowdsource and assist you. So if you have something that you found someone on this correspondent file and you're not sure if there's going to be a record, you could create a free account, put in your inquiry like this lady did, and you'll often get back a detailed explanation from the archivist who tells you what records could be available. So think about going to historyhub.history.gov and signing up for the free account. Now, how about Giovanni here? He's got a wife and he's got 3 children, and we see he was admitted. Well, if he's admitted, it means that he was held first. So we then want to look on the notations, and we see that he was appealed. So he appealed his deportation order. Well, when you see lots of information about appealed, you want to think about going to the National Archives catalog, and I have this link on your handout here, and you want to go to this particular database. In this catalog, you want to put in the name of the person that you see made the appeal, and you find they did list them on the index card. So there he is with his wife, and what do you have? You have a number on the left-hand side that you can then order the file about Giovanni and what happened. So you're going to submit your request by email to the archivist there in Washington, D.C. There's 22,000 boxes. Not all files still exist, but they usually will tell you if they find it and how much it will cost to have. Now, let's see about our friend Bertha here. Now, we see a lot of information and little notes written all over her, but what do we see? We see the word paroled. Well, that's a very unusual word to see. I wonder if Bertha has some problems. Maybe she has some files. So I'm going to go look at Bertha and I see all of these notations. She appealed to the department. I find her in the database that she had correspondence made. So this tells me I need to perhaps contact the USCIS and see if they have some records about her. And I see her visa expired while she was waiting to sail, and she was paroled, and she had to get a new visa, and she had to pay a fine to re-enter the US through Canada or Mexico. And we get all this detailed information about her interview and what happened to her. She has to have an application to extend her stay. We read all about where she was born, who her parents were, and things like that. We find these ID cards and a photo of her because this was in the 1940s. We also can go to the USCIS and see if there's an index search for more results. So whenever you see lots and lots of notations about your ancestor, maybe that means there's a file. Now, what about if they had an illness? We talked about hospitalization and medical, and they called it a 6-second physical. So were they out of breath? Were they limping? The clerk would take a chalk mark and put a letter. Oh, maybe their goiter isn't good, so you may see a G. Maybe they're lame, you may see a letter L. So you may see that listed on their physical exam. So here is another example from the Park Service of a card for a gentleman, and he was sent to the hospital in 1925. So we see this gentleman here, Ayers Lambda. He is in hospital and he is discharged. And the reason he's discharged is because he's a likely public charge because he has gonorrhea. Now, there's no antibiotics, and so they say, no, we don't need you in this country. And the far right, we see that he was sent back because of this. Maybe there's a file. Maybe he tried to immigrate into a different port. You have no idea. Now let's jump over to verifications of landing. So before 1924, if your ancestor was living here and they wanted to go back home, there was no assurance that they would be let back in again. So they would contact the INS and say, could you go through and verify I came in as I originally said, and it should be noted, and so I don't have any problems when I come back into the US. So what you might see is someone like this, a verification of landing for Tave Talgren, and above his name we see VL989176771. So this should be a big red flag for you that says he perhaps arrived earlier. This is not his first time. So this is what I found when I went through his and found his naturalization records. He told me when he first arrived. So as you see a VL, you want to see when they came in the first time. How about if they came after 1924? They changed the laws and you could actually then get a permit. You didn't have to get a verification. So you may see notations on the form about your ancestor going and getting a permit. So we see Philip Christensen coming in May of 1920, and above his name, we see P1389 Tacoma. So we know that he got his permit in Tacoma, Washington, and I was able to then find his immigration records, and it's a clue. Maybe you had no idea where he settled. So definitely look to see if your ancestor has a permit. And also, what do you want to look for? A second immigration entry, because he likely came and went a couple times if he went to go get a permit. How about CL and CA? Have you ever seen this notation? So there's two differences between the two. The certificate of arrival was sent to the courthouse after the immigrant arrived, and it often is found with the documentations when they got naturalized. You never have really noticed this little notation. I think it can be overlooked a lot. So what do you see if you find something like this? Let's show an example. We have Pierre Nucheli. We see next to her name CL20526. So we understand that to mean, and on your handout, you can see what district she did her naturalization is in District 2, which is in New York. There's an X, meaning that her certificate of arrival was paid prior to 1906. We get her certificate number. We see a 505, meaning she went to the INS and said, I want to become a citizen. They used Form 505 to verify that she did arrive when she said they did. So they issued a certificate of landing on the form in 1941. That's what all of those numbers mean. So when we go look at Pierre's naturalization or declaration of intent, we see that she lists herself as immigrating as Père Neuchâtel, but now she's known as Pauline Morgulese. And in the box there, we see that 2X104230, which was listed on the passenger list. How about we meet George here? He has some numbers next to his name. Well, he has 4X 3549505 So we can see that George likely arrived in April of 1898 and he wanted to become a citizen. Well, he did this in the district of 4X, Well, according to the link I provided, it was likely done in the Northeast in DC, Maryland, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. So that code can assist you in narrowing down where and when your ancestor likely naturalized. So when I went and found his declaration of intent, again, I find that 4X number listed on his form. I go out to the 1940 census and I see he's listed there, and he lists PA, meaning he has filed his first papers to become a citizen, but unfortunately he died before completing the paperwork. But at least I knew where to look for his declaration of intent based upon that code. So on your handout, you can see these codes because they had changed over time. District 1 was Boston, Boston, Boston all the time, but in the early period, it was Rhode Island. Then it went to Connecticut. Now, how about a CA? Now, a certificate of arrival, because the person arrived post 1906. So we have the lovely Honoria Christiana O'Connell listed here. Now we see 2651225 listed. So when we go get her naturalization paperwork, we're going to find her CA listed there, her certificate of arrival, and it confirms she did arrive on the President Polk, and it matches the number listed there. So that should be a big red flag to you that yes, my ancestor did get naturalized, and I should find that certificate of arrival embedded in their naturalization documents. So here's my grandfather. I showed you arriving in 1910, but there's no notation list there when he came through in 1910. When he wanted to become a citizen in 1913, they went through and made a tiny little notation. You can barely see it, 231551112. Well, that's my clue that he wanted to become a citizen. So when I went and found his petitions for naturalization, it lists him as being in 23, indicating he started the naturalization process in Arizona or Southern California. So if you see little numbers like that, again, that's your red flag. My ancestor did become a citizen. And here's some other just random examples of all of those different numbers that you're going to see listed there and the different districts. 11 district, number 7, number 2, and next to them oftentimes the number, and then oftentimes a date, which is either their verification of landing or their date of naturalization. Now let's talk about quotas and visas. There were, of course, constantly changing laws about quotas and visas. Most importantly, 1921, 1924, they made very drastic changes based upon the censuses. You will see immigrant visas for people who wanted to reside here permanently, and non-immigrant visas, students, travelers, things like that. So that in Act of 1924, everyone had to go to a U.S. embassy in their country and get a visa. You're going to see what they call quota visas and non-quota visas. The act exempted those highly skilled workers and wives or actors and things like that. So these were legally allowed to enter the US, and you would need a reentry permit, and visitors would need a passport visa. So these are things you may want to contact the National Archives and see if you can find something. So we have Bridget here, who's Swiss, living in Honduras in 1941, and she applied for a non-quota visa because she is Swiss and not subject to quotas, versus Johanna on the bottom is from Holland and in the US, and she applied in Amsterdam, and she's got to have a quota visa. So you may want to see if there's some documentation associated with her, especially if this would be included in your A file if it was created after 1944. So this is something that the National Archives could assist you with. So you also may want to scowl the records on these passenger lists and look in column 24 where they asked questions to your ancestor. Do you want to stay in the US? Do you want to become a citizen? Things like they ask these questions. So this gentleman answered these questions, and I was able to find his paperwork that yes, he wanted to stay here, and yes, he wanted to become a citizen. So look in column 24 and see how they answered those questions. You also may want to look at what little numbers are listed next to their name. We have Ernest Savage. He's listed as a 3-1, which means he's a government official, and his visa was issued in Edinburgh. Herbert Butt is 3-2, meaning he's here on pleasure. John Brown, 3-3, he's just in transit. All of these little numbers mean what kind of visa that they obtained. A non-quota immigrant, such as Mildred Addy here. She's 4A. She's a child of a U.S. citizen. Tina, she's 4B, an immigrant previously admitted to the U.S. Rebecca, 4C, she's from Canada, on and on and on. So each of these little numbers can mean something. When we also see quota immigrants. So Winifred could not be specified by the Act of 1924 because of her husband's status. So you may see notations such as that. Depending, a lot of women's status was based upon their husbands. Or at the bottom here, we see Irish immigrants. They were agricultural workers. How about passports for just visiting the US? So you may see, like Margarita here, she had what they called a PV or a passport visa. She was just, according to the records here, she was just coming to visit. She was going to go back, and she didn't have any indication that she wanted to become a citizen. So these visa applications for passports were destroyed, and these aren't available. So unfortunately, this is all you're going to learn about her. You want to think about ordering from the USCIS some of these visa forms. They're normally made, if there's notations on here, there may be more information in these files, especially if your ancestor got this visa for that 20-year period of 1924 to 1944. That's when you want to contact the USCIS and see if they have any records. So today we talked about numbers, not on board, citizenship, likely public charges, held for special inquiry. Did they get deported? Were there medical certificates? Verification of landing, regarding naturalization, and did they need a visa? A lot of these should be a red flag for you that you may find some more information about your ancestor. So thank you so much for your time today. My name is Christine Cohen. I hope I've given you some new information that you weren't aware of before, and you'll go look at those manifests and see if those numbers now perhaps mean something. On your handout, I have some great references to some interesting articles that could give even more detail about what these codes mean. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Christine, can you help me get the handout into the chat?
Oh, okay.
Um,
So go in, do you have the PDF version there?
I did. Let me go back and get it. Am I going to?
So you're just going to go into chat
Okay.
and you're just going to click on meeting group chat, and you're just going to click on the icon that says file. It's the third one over. It looks like a piece of paper with a little corner folded over. I can do it if you don't, if it's not easy to you. Just a moment, let me go find it. It's in my folder here. Let's see. So there's a PDF should populate.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back up and see what the
I see one question from Bill. Why would there be a YMCA? Because the was a Young Men's Christian Association, and so they could assist people, especially men, young Christian men, with coming into the US if they were having trouble. That was one of the organizations that was there to assist people. I don't think I see any other. I know that's a lot of information to take in one hour. I think the handout does a good job of kind of explaining a lot of them. And like I said, there's also a lot of great links I have in my handouts. I encourage you to maybe make an account at that History Hub website. the archivists at the National Archives are crowdsourcing and other archive and other really smart genealogists because immigration is a very complex issue regarding A files and naturalization files and things like that. So if you're having troubles, I encourage you to type something in there and see if they can get your question answered.
Okay, we have one that says, what is a green card?
Oh, that's more of a modern phenomenon. um, that someone coming here as an immigrant, as a resident alien would be issued a green card, but that's going to a more phenomenon, a more um, 20th century phenomenon
Okay.
versus when our ancestors were coming here long, long time ago.
I have someone sitting here with me and I'm gonna have her read her questions. Go ahead.
Um, the question about the green cards, I used to have one before I became a US citizen. When did green cards
I I
start?
don't know. I do not know off the top of my head. I did not see any information when I put this presentation went together. My suggestion, maybe someone in the chat will know off the top of their head. My other suggestion would just use Google. That's Google is always your friend. And just type in, when did the United States begin to issue green cards? And I'm sure that that will be listed on there.
Okay, she's got another question, but I want to say something to the group. Christine has graciously let us do a recording, and it's going to be on our Facebook, not Facebook, I'm sorry, our YouTube channel. I won't be back into work until Thursday, and I plan on sending you guys a link to that through the emails that you left for me when you signed up. So look for it Thursday to come through, that you'll get a link so that you can go over it again.
And one of our participants, Adrian, was kind enough to put in green card started in 1940, and I did a Google search, and that is what I found, that the alien registration receipt cards started to be issued regarding the Alien Registration Act of 1940. So that's when you're going to start seeing those green cards.
Okay, we have another question.
Well, I had a comment. The sexism for women seemed to be detained and not men.
Yeah.
When the DN, I can't read my writing. Or when the do not sail was canceled, was their passage refunded?
I think so, because they did not sail. And so they probably went back to their agent and they said, I didn't sail. And then they just applied it to their next destination. But I've never actually seen anybody talk about that, but I've got to think that they would be, because there's no way an immigrant would have enough money to keep trying over and over again. I would highly doubt it. So maybe they had to pay a little bit of a penalty for missing the ship, perhaps, maybe, a pound or two, a franc or two, or something like that. But I would sure seem like it should have been refunded.
The next question is the person doing the questioning before sailing. If this questioning was done in a foreign country before the passenger boarded a ship so that entry was less likely to be denied when they reached the American port,
Right.
is that a civil servant living in the foreign country?
It's going to mostly be the ticket agent. It's going to be like your travel agent, if you think about it. They were acting as a middleman before and then they're supplying it to the clerk of the ship.
And some writing is in red, that red grease pencil. I've noticed it in some death certificates or Civil War records or notices. Why was it red?
I don't think I've ever seen why it was red. I just think it's probably because that was the easiest thing that's going to stand out on a white piece of paper, on a gray piece of paper. Having a red pencil is going to really stand out to the clerk of, yep, I did my job.
That makes sense. Okay. Let's see. Are there any other questions for Christine?
So I hope I've given you some ideas tonight about going and looking at some numbers, some letters. And like I said, if your ancestor you weren't sure if they naturalized, maybe now you'll have a code to go look at where they did naturalize based upon those district codes that are listed there. Definitely if they were made 3 attempts, like my friend Anthony there, who decided he was coming to America, darn it, but he just needed 3 tries before he could get here. I have no idea why it took him so long. I just thought he was a great representation about each time he went to the travel agent and said, I'm going to America and here's my information. And then, nope, it didn't work out. And we went to, and each time he just gave a little bit of different information. So make sure you scour those to see if they made more than 1 attempt. Like my grandfather came in 1910 from England to New Mexico, worked for 3 years, went back to England, married my grandmother, then came back to the US by himself. Then my grandmother came over 2 more years later afterward. So, like I said, think about seeing if your ancestor went back and forth more than one time. I think people don't think of our ancestors as very mobile, and I think they were more mobile than we realize. So I encourage you to go review and see maybe they did go once or twice, like my grandpa did, to marry their sweetheart, to bring their family over, or something like that. So if you have any follow-up information or questions or things like that, or please feel free to reach out to me. My information is on the handout for my website and my contact information. So Kathy, thank you so very much for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something.
Oh, it was really great. Thank you so much. And thank
Yes.
you all for attending. I appreciate your attendance. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.